I did my thesis show on the life of Galileo, and it was really interesting. The director had chosen this direction with this play, in which the Lamed Vov, who are the 25 most compassionate people in the world, um, how it goes is whenever they stop being compassionate, the saying is that, or the tradition is, or the idea is that they stop that the end of the world will happen. So the Lama Vov characters were the 25 people, most compassionate people in the world. That when they stopped being compassionate, that's when Armageddon was supposed to happen. And this was the direction that this director took in the play. So that each narrator who was foretelling the story of Galileo Galilei, who discovered that the sun is the center of the universe and the earth actually rotates around that, um, went with this direction. And it was really interesting because the life of Galileo Galilei was centered around the idea of these church, the Holy Roman Church, having the ultimate power of a church considering itself on par with God. And the problem that the scientists that the church had with the scientist Galileo Galilei was that he took away that authority, that ecocentric, or that mankind centric idea, by just putting the earth as just another planet, the sun being the focus or the center, and the earth no longer having that position of power and authority. And the church had a huge problem with it, so much so that they forced Galileo Galilei to recant his scientific discovery. So even though he saw this and he witnessed it, and he wrote, he could show people that this is the case, that here is the sun and here is the earth, even though, or based on how he mapped it, and I really don't remember how he did it. That part wasn't really in the play. It was more of after the discovery and then how things happened. But here is, plus it's been many, many years ago. But here is this scientist who made this incredible discovery that's going to affect how everything happens, and future discoveries, and it brings us a lot more knowledgeable about our planet, and how our earth works. And here is a church who has a huge problem with it, so much so that they throw him in jail and they make him recant. And I think about that play, and I think about how our religion, our Christianity religion right now, is approaching science, where we have these scientists and they tell us this is what's happening, this is what's going on, this is the thing. And our churches and our religion, and the people who are being the mouthpieces of Christianity, are choosing to say, no, science, you're wrong, you're wrong, wrong, wrong. Why? Because I don't know. Because it's a, I guess because it counters some kind of idea of what God is. That this science can't exist because God exists, which is ridiculous, because if we look at God in perspective of science, then we see God as a great engineer. And we can see how God still fits into all the discoveries of science. But what's happening in our world right now, in our nation right now, it reminds me a lot about what was happening with Galileo Galilei back in the 1600s Italy. Whenever he came forward with this discovery of science, and the church chose not to believe it. And I think that's really relevant to what's happening now. And I think it's a wake-up call, because as we saw, it didn't matter what the church thought. The discovery was so. Science is so. And it doesn't matter if you don't believe in science, it's still so. And I tell people all the time, okay, well, if you don't believe in science, then you better get out of the way of a tornado, because you don't want to stand in a tornado and claim that you don't believe it and therefore it doesn't exist, because it will show you that it really does exist. And that's very dangerous for you to do that. And it's the same way when we look at these these effects of science, if we consider that we live in an ecosystem, and that when we introduce toxins into an ecosystem that doesn't have any kind of predator or any kind of thing that will fight against it, that new introduction of a chemical or a toxin is going to overtake the environment. It's going to overtake the ecosystem. And you can watch the Magic School Bus. I watched it with my daughter, and it was all about the ecosystem and how this new species of plant was introduced into this ecosystem and it never had it before, and it overtook it. And we can look at the kudzu epidemic. I think it was FDR's wife who decided that she was going to bring kudzu into the States from, I think it was Japan, in order to take care of a problem. And in the kudzu, if you look along the eastern area, there's kudzu that's just completely growing. It's overgrowth, and it's just taking over the state. And so when you introduce something into an environment that it doesn't have any kind of natural predators on, then you create a problem. And then I think they brought in some kind of animal to take care of that. And then that had a huge population problem. And then they brought in another thing, and that had a huge population problem. So each time you try to play with science, that there's a cause and effect that ends up happening. There's a consequence, because science is consequential. For every action, there's a reaction, equal or opposite reaction. And so science does not exist in a bubble, and therefore we can't think that science exists in a bubble just because we are narrow-minded with our minds and refusing to acknowledge science. And a lot of that also has to do with whenever we think about just about anything. If science says, okay, temperatures accelerating is going to cause this, or an excessive amount of carbon dioxide is going to cause the pores of the plants to shrink, and then they're not going to be able to take in as much carbon dioxide and the plants will die. And my big thing is, and I have a t-shirt that says this because I've been wondering this actually, is what happens? Okay, so your body needs oxygen. It has to have oxygen. There's no doubt about that. Your body can't survive without oxygen. You have to have it. It requires for all your organs to function, your blood to flow. No oxygen, your body dies. So your body has to have oxygen. That's a given. There's no refuting that. And then you have to look at the things that actually make oxygen. So where is our oxygen coming from? Well, I know from my third grade science class that it came from plants. Okay, so we have plants, but if we start plowing over our plants with concrete, and we start plowing up our plants for pipelines, and we start doing all these things that start getting rid of our plants for deforestation, we get rid of our trees, where is our oxygen supposed to come from? And I've been asking this question. I've done some research, and you have the oceans that have, I think you can do the concentrated oxygen that they get from the ocean, and I think it might be the plants inside the ocean that's used for hospitals, and the concentrated. But one, is there enough? And concentrated oxygen is certainly not going to be the same as the oxygen that we just naturally take for granted. Are we going to have to build domes around our cities? And then what happens to the people who aren't inside those domes? You go almost back to the sci-fi novelists who considered these ideas, I guess. And you really start thinking about it. Okay, when we don't have oxygen, or when we're not making oxygen because we're putting too much into something that's killing the trees and the plants that are actually supposed to produce our oxygen, where does it come from? Is grass enough? But if we plow up our grass and we replace it with astroturf, then we don't have those oxygen producing things. So I think when we look at the whole idea of climate and science, when it comes to that, is we have to look at our place in it, which is oxygen. If we destroy the things that make oxygen, what do we do? Where's it going to come from? And how do we make it? Because unless we come up with some kind of weird scientific contraption, some kind of AI robot that can convert oxygen from toxins that we put into the air, or to take this massive amount of carbon dioxide and transform it into oxygen, I don't know how we're going to do this. And there are machines out there that are supposed to be carbon dioxide is supposed to take the carbon dioxide, but they're not transforming it into oxygen. And I think I read that they weren't really doing much for that carbon dioxide problem. So when we look at oxygen and carbon dioxide, if we have too much carbon dioxide into our body, we get a situation called monoxide poisoning. And that's really bad because then your organs shut down. And so when we look at science and we look at climate control, we want to look in terms of oxygen and carbon dioxide, because those are the two chemical components that are most important to us, because without oxygen, our bodies shut down. Too much carbon dioxide, our bodies shut down. And so we can't just look at the money situation. We have to look at the human situation, because we're going to be affecting our ability to breathe and to live if we don't. So again, we can't say science doesn't exist because God creates everything, because God created the molecules. God created the chemical components. God created the scientific charts that we use. God already created it, and we're just using science in order to determine what that discovery is, and all those secret worlds that we've yet to unlock because we don't have the machinery that can see tiny enough to go past the atoms. Is there something beyond the atom? Is there something beyond the molecule that we just haven't invented yet? It's not that it's not there. And it's not that science just happens because the discovery, we make the invention of the tool to be able to see it and suddenly science is there. Science has always been there. It's up to us to discover it. And when we do discover it, it's really stupid to say, oh, those discoveries don't exist, because God does everything. Because God did make it, and it's up to us to figure out what that is. And it's up to us to take our discoveries and learn from it. And if we don't, we're going to be like the same situation that Galileo Galilei had. We're going to throw our scientists into jail for what? Because it made us remove our own self-importance out of the equation. Well, I'm sorry, but mankind has no self-importance when it comes to God anyway. So I don't know what the big deal is. I don't know why Christians are so anti-science, because we're not supposed to be on par with God anyways. So when it comes to science, we really have to embrace the fact that science is with God, because God created the molecules. God created everything. God created our ecosystem. God created things for a specific design and purpose. And it's really interesting. If you look at the circulatory aspect of how our whole entire universe is created, we have a solar system that works in a circulatory aspect. We have our respiratory system that takes blood, takes the air, and it works in a circulatory aspect. Our entire blood system, our circulatory system, works in the circulatory aspect, with the heart being the center. It takes the blood from the heart and it pumps it all the way through the body, and it comes back up through the heart, and it does it again and again and again. So everything that we're looking at, the ecosystem, where everything works in a circulatory system, the food chain, everything works in the circulatory system. The digestive system, we've taken food, it works through a circulatory system, it goes back into the earth transforms it into vegetation and plants that we end up needing for the oxygen. Remember that? So everything is working in this circulatory system, which means everything is connected to each other. Nothing is working within as far as I know, in a linear system where one thing is not connected to something else. So whenever it looks at science, we have to consider science as being a big part of us, because anything that happens in science is going to happen to us. It's going to affect us, because there's certain things about our body that requires certain things of science, and our bodies do not produce our own oxygen. It's also like our bodies also don't produce its own salt. I learned that from the book History of Salt, which I didn't know that. And I talked about this before, where the ancient Chinese used to be able to tax their citizens or penalize or reward their citizens based on the tax of salt. interesting how our bodies is created, where we're relying. We are almost forced to rely on the science in order to continue to have our existence. And we cannot act like our science does not exist, because we end up hurting ourselves. Certain toxins into the air, if we absorb it into our respiratory system, if we absorb it into our blood, if we absorb it into our skin, creates a scientific reaction that ends up hurting ourselves. So I don't know where all these ideas are coming from, that people are claiming that science doesn't exist, or we can ignore this data, or we can ignore this data, or we can ignore this data because it doesn't support an agenda. Because the bottom line is, science directly affects our bodies. And if we ignore science, we can end up hurting our bodies. If we ignore the things that make our oxygen, unless you have some kind of idea of where oxygen is coming from, that's not, part of the photosynthesis idea. And photosynthesis, that's another thing that's circulatory. And, so where does oxygen come from if we get rid of the things that naturally produce oxygen? Where do the things come from that our body needs if we decide that that is no longer important and money is more important? So these are the things I would like you to think about, because Christianity is playing this really big role in science, and it really shouldn't, because Christianity should embrace science, because science is God. And science lets us explore more about this incredible universe that God created. So by understanding science, we're able to then take those understandings and then apply it to God and apply it to ourselves. So because Christianity is playing such a huge role, I have to question why. Because we do not live in bubbles, and we are not immune from the effects of science, because our bodies require certain things. And if it doesn't get those things, it shuts down. If our body gets exposed to toxins and certain things, we have an effect that will hurt our bodies. So these are the things I really want you to consider. And I don't want us to act like the churches of Galileo Galilei time, where we feel like we can just lock up anybody who opposes our agendas of our churches or our religious dogmas, because it presents a new idea that we never considered before. Because that new idea is the discovery. And our science, as scientists, is all about discovering. That's their job, is to continue to study and discover more and more and more and more. And hopefully we find cures. If we find cures to something, why in the world would we then position ourselves to be like, nope, I'm not going to go for that cure. I'm going to trust God to save us. It reminds me of that story when the man is on the roof and he's praying to God, God, please save me, as the flood is taking over his town and it's rising higher and higher. And here comes a boat to come save him. And he says, nope, God will save me. And here comes another transportation vessel, and he says, nope, God will save me. And here comes another one, and he's like, nope, God will save me, because he's looking for some divine miracle that's coming from God, when the ability to save yourself was there. It was already right there in front of you, and you chose not to do it. So taking this idea that science is an opposition of God is really dangerous, because it ends up removing the boats that are coming to us and saying, oh, well, here's the problem. The scientists have discovered the cure for this problem. You can use it, and it's not going to hurt your relationship with God, because God not only created the chemicals of what they've discovered, he created everything, all the molecules that they're putting together. And it's your job to figure out how those things work. And the more we discover about our science and about our environment and about ourselves, the more we learn about God. So how in the rare world can there be a conflict of interest? It should be, oh, wow, okay, this is a great discovery. And then let's apply it to here and see, maybe Christ really talked about it. And because his audience were, you can't tell biblical time audience that, hey, the internet is a way to be able to communicate with people all over the world, when the only way you can get from place to place is on a donkey or in some kind of animal or walking. Can you imagine if somebody came to you and said, 1,000 years in the future and tried to tell you about something they had there, and you wouldn't, you would suddenly trust them and accept them and believe them, especially when that person had no credibility to begin with? So I think if we just become a little bit more open as Christians and more open with our Bible, and we start really embracing the things that we already know about our world, and we try to figure out how that makes God a little bit more real to us, we're going to be doing a lot better than saying, science, you don't exist. We're going to lock all the scientists up because they challenged our ideas of our churches, and bring us right back to 1600s whenever the churches did that. That's not what we're going to do here. And hopefully that's not what we're going to do here, because this is the United States of America, and that's not how we act. So those are the things I want you to consider, and especially the oxygen, carbon dioxide equation, because without oxygen, our bodies shut down. So where does that oxygen come from? And if we don't have that solution of where the oxygen comes from, then maybe we shouldn't destroy all the plants that actually are providing the oxygen for us, because we don't have another alternative. And if we get rid of our oxygen supply, we're done as humans.